Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we are going to be starting lots of seeds together. We're going to be starting a few different kinds of cucumbers. I have a few pumpkins that I want to get started and also some melons. Now, we are going to be starting these in these pots on my deck. There are a few reasons why I've chosen this method to start these seeds. Now, this isn't necessarily the method I'm going to recommend for everyone because it depends a lot on your situation. Now, these plants, the ones I'm starting today, are all plants that really prefer to be direct sown. When I have a plant that I'm trying to grow that likes to be direct sown, that does well with sticking the seed directly in the ground where it's ultimately going to live the rest of its life, that's usually what I like to do. Had to move over because we had a rainstorm a little bit ago and there was a spot dripping on me, so moved over a little bit to avoid that. Anyway, I like to do that because it's a lot easier. You know, it involves much less maintenance. And also if the plant prefers that, usually the kind of plants that prefer that are plants that don't really like their roots disturbed, and also plants that can grow to maturity and produce their fruit or whatever you're going to be harvesting from them in, you know, a shorter amount of time, so they don't necessarily need the extended growing season that they get from being started inside. So the reason why I am starting some of these plants on my deck in these pots is because the last few years, my cucumbers especially, but all the plants that I'm starting today have really been plagued by, I think it's by slugs. Now what's been happening is when I sow the seeds in the ground, basically as soon as it germinates, something comes along and nips the top off. You know, there's a couple different candidates for what kind of pest that could be, but based on my observations, I'm thinking in my case it was slugs. So the best solution that I have found, I've tried a variety of different solutions here. The best one that works for me is to start my plants in pots until they're a little bit larger. You know, keep them growing in the pot until they're a little bit larger before transplanting them out in the ground. Because I found that when they're a little bit larger, I'm not sure if it's that the slugs don't mess with them as much or they're just able to withstand the damage a little more. When they first emerge from the ground, they're really small and they're really vulnerable. So I like to just start them here to get them past that little stage. So last year I did a little bit of an experiment where I tried my squash and cucumbers and all those types of plants. I tried planting them 3 different ways. I'll link that video in the video description so you can see the 3 different options. And all of the options were successful to some extent or another. But this year I decided to at least start with this, and I may, depending on how this goes, I might use some of those other options as well. So I've got my tray all laid out here with all these individual pots, and I've got a few extras in this tray here. These little 6-packs, I'm probably just going to throw some nasturtium seeds or some other type of flower just to give a little head start. And then the rest of these will be the plants we mentioned: cucumbers, squash, well, pumpkin specifically, and melons. Now, all of the plants that I'm starting today are frost sensitive. So that means that if there's any frost, these plants will die. This is the reason why, or this is one of the reasons why I'm starting them in pots now. You know, I mentioned about the slugs, but another reason is that if we get an unexpected frost, at this point in my season, you know, it's about 10 days out from our estimated last frost date, but the 10-day forecast doesn't show any days below, you know, the low 40s. So or any nights that low, I should say. I don't think that we will be getting another frost, but just in case, this way if another frost does pop up in the forecast unexpectedly, I can just bring this tray inside and leave it on my counter overnight, and then the seedlings will be completely fine. I obviously wouldn't have that option if I had planted them out in the ground. So now the reason why I'm growing them in pots out here on my deck as opposed to pots inside under my grow lights is because, for one, you know, it just takes up less space under my grow lights. I like to, you know, we're kind of at the point in the season where I am starting to rotate a lot of the plants that are under my grow lights outside. So there's a little more space under my grow lights, but for the most part, it's usually pretty crowded under there. My space is limited. And so when possible, I like to have as many things outside, not taking up space under my grow lights, as possible. The other reason is that it's going to be a little bit less of a transition for these plants. When they come up, you know, when you grow plants inside in your house in really controlled conditions, like under the grow lights, they are not used to growing outside. They're not used to outdoor conditions, and you have to gradually acclimate them to the outdoors. By planting these plants outside in these pots, that gives me the flexibility, as I said, to bring them inside if we get an unexpected cold night. But these plants are going to come out outside under the sunshine, you know, in the weather conditions, used to temperature fluctuations and wind and just all of the things that nature is going to throw at them. They're going to be used to it right from the beginning, just as if they were direct sown. So that means I get to skip the whole hardening off process. It makes it a little bit easier of a transition for my plants as well. So the only transition that these plants will have to deal with is some hopefully minimal root disturbance when I actually transplant them out into the garden. I'm going to transplant them out when they're fairly small, when their roots are, you know, pretty small and still easily fit in these pots here. So that's the rundown of what I'm doing and why. So I will just show you what exactly we're going to be planting in these pots, and then we'll get planting. So in here, as I said, I've got cucumbers, various kinds of cucumbers. I've got a few melons. And then in here is my winter squash container, which I will be planting some pumpkin seeds from. So here's the stack of seeds that I'm planning to plant today. I've got, I think, 3 cucumber varieties that I'm planning to grow. The first is homemade pickles. These are seeds that I saved a couple years ago, actually, from a cucumber that I grew in my garden. And they're a little bit old now. So this will go on to, you know, pretty high on my priority list as far as saving seeds this season, because I think I need to replace these with some fresh seeds. So homemade pickles is probably my favorite pickling cucumber. I also like to pickle the silver slicer, which is the next one I'm going to grow. We'll talk about that in a minute. But homemade pickles is my favorite that's actually considered a pickling cucumber. You know, they're medium-sized, on the smaller side because they are picklers, and it's a nice medium green. They've been really prolific, really dependable for me, and yeah, I just like them. They've performed better than other similar varieties that I've grown in the past. Now, I did mention the silver slicer as well. These are also seeds that I saved. These are from last season, so these should be nice and fresh. So the silver slicer, while it is known as a slicing cucumber, I do also use it to make some refrigerator pickles as well. And you know, the opposite is also true. The homemade pickles, while it's considered a pickling cucumber, I do also use that for a slicing cucumber. So they're pretty versatile. I think the main difference between slicer and picklers is water content, but you know, you can experiment with using them multiple ways and it usually works fine. The final cucumber that I'm growing is the lemon cucumber. This one we really just use as a snacking cucumber. So it's great. You know, my son likes to eat these like an apple. You can see they're really cool. They're like round yellow cucumbers. Those are a lot of fun. They're nice and sweet. They yield really well. So because we're only having those for snacking, I'll just grow a couple plants of those, but I always have to include those in the garden. Now when it comes to pumpkins, this one is new to me, the winter luxury pumpkin. This is supposed to be a really good pumpkin for pies and baking, things like that. This is my first year growing this pumpkin. I've never tried it before. I don't think I've ever eaten it before. So this will be a fun one to try. I'm planning, you know, my plan may change slightly, but since this is a smaller pumpkin, I think it's a little bit larger than maybe the classic sugar pie pumpkin, but definitely smaller than a lot of those huge pumpkins you see. I'm going to at least experiment with growing some of these on one of my arched trellises out in the side yard garden, which over there, I don't think you can really see it from this angle. So I'm going to experiment with a trellis of these and we'll see how they do. Next, I have 2 mini pumpkins. I grew both of these last year and really liked both of them. We have the Baby Boo, which is the mini white, and I also have Jack Be Little, which is the mini orange. So I enjoyed growing both of these last year. I grew these on one of my arched trellises. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that this year. I also have a chain link fence over there, so I may let them climb the fence. I haven't figured out exactly where these are ultimately going to be transplanted to, but these are just what I'm growing for now. Finally, for pumpkins, I have, hopefully I pronounced this correctly, Musky de Provence. I grew this pumpkin last year for the first time, and this is a large pumpkin. You know, the plant got huge. It really took over my garden. It was a beautiful plant. It was kind of fun, actually. And I think I only got a couple pumpkins from it, but with the pumpkins being so large, I was fine with that. So I roasted them, pureed the flesh. I let some of the liquid drain out of them. And then some of them I baked with right away, and some of them I put in Ziploc baggies in my freezer. I actually still have some frozen pumpkin in my freezer, so I'll have to make sure to use that before this year's harvest of these pumpkins is ready. Finally, I have a couple melon varieties I'm going to try. We have Hale's Best Jumbo Cantaloupe. I tried growing this last year, and I think the slugs may have eaten all my seedlings or something. I know I didn't, something happened to them and I didn't end up harvesting any. So we're going to try it again this year using this method. Hopefully it works a little better. And finally, the Kajari melon. I have tried growing this one a couple times. This is a little personal sized melon, and I've never actually eaten it because despite the fact that I've tried growing it several times, I've never been successful. So I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, if this variety is just a little bit pickier. If you have experience with it, please let me know. but I will be trying that again this year. If it's not successful this year, this will probably be the final time I try it, unless I get some great new idea for the right way to try it. So let's get planting. So I'm going to start with 8 plants each of the silver slicer and the homemade pickles. So these are rows of 4, so we'll just do 2 rows of each of these to start with. So I'm just going to mark that the whole row will be silver slicer, and this next whole row will be silver slicer as well. I have a couple extra tags left from last year, so I may stick those in here. And then in the next row, we're going to have homemade pickles. Homemade pickles. This next row of 4 will be lemon cucumbers. So as with pretty much all seeds, you want to first refer to your seed packet for information on how to plant them. As you can see, I have a couple of these here that I saved from my garden, saved them myself, so I don't have information in these seed packets. Now I can just follow the same information as for this cucumber, or I can look at the size of the seed, and you can see about how wide these are. So I'm going to plant that about ½ inch deep. That is what the seed packet says, and that's also the appropriate depth for a seed of this size. So I'm just going to go through all of these pots here that I have labeled for my cucumbers, plant them about ½ inch deep, and cover them with soil. I think what I'm going to do, maybe not the silver slicer because I know I just saved those last year. The other 2, the homemade pickles that I saved myself and this lemon cucumber, are a little bit older seeds. So I will probably plant 2, I'm just going to go ahead and do 2 of each in all of these pots here, and then I can always thin out to the strongest seedling later. Just make 2 little divots in each pot. Let me see, on opposite corners of the pot so that it's easier to thin out the seedling when I need to thin them out later, assuming that they both germinate. So just about ½ inch. I'm not being incredibly precise with this because it doesn't have to be perfect. So when it comes to planting depth for seeds, you don't have to get out a ruler and measure exactly. It's a guideline. Now you do want to follow it fairly closely because what your seed needs, different seeds have different needs, but what most seeds need is they need to be planted in some sort of medium, usually soil, that is going to hold moisture and allow them to absorb the moisture that they need to germinate. It's also going to give them something that they can sink their roots down into. And additionally, so that's the reason why you want to plant deep enough, to make sure that your seed has everything that it needs to germinate. You don't want to plant too deeply, however, because each of these seeds here contains energy from the parent plant, the plant that grew the seed, but it only has a limited amount of energy. So each of these seeds have enough energy to absorb the water they need, to be able to send their root down, and to send up their first set of leaves. The seed is depending on those first set of leaves to reach the soil surface within a certain amount of time, and then to be able to reach the sunlight and start generating energy for the plant to be able to grow. So if your seed is planted too deeply, it might not have energy to reach the surface. So that's why we want to follow the guidelines for spacing. But that being said, if I plant it slightly too deep or slightly too shallowly, it will probably still be fine. Seeds are very adaptable, but we just want to follow it, as closely as we can without stressing ourselves out. So my silver slicers are all planted. I'm just going to go ahead and plant the homemade pickles and lemon cucumbers exactly the same way, and I'll meet you back here. So I'm just going to go through and plant the rest of these seeds pretty much the same way. Now my pumpkins say to plant about 1 inch deep, and my cantaloupes, or my melons, say to plant about ½ inch deep. So I'm just going to plant them exactly the same way I planted the cucumbers, and I will be sure to keep you updated on these plants as they germinate and as we transplant them out into the garden. Really excited about getting to harvest lots of these delicious fruits this season. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Thank you just for, starting all these seeds with me. If you have any tips for the best way that you have found to successfully grow cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, things like that, especially when it comes to protecting them from slugs and other pests that may eat them as soon as they first germinate, go ahead and leave those in the comments because I would love to hear from you. Also, let me know what new varieties or just what varieties you're excited to grow this year because I'd love to hear that too. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.